one of over 40 organisations around the country that in the wake of the referendum sprang up organically, I'd say, and independently, because in the immediate aftermath there was obviously some serious head scratching going on with the political heavyweights, and many other membership organisations were left really depressed, I'd say. So there was a huge void to be filled, and it's people like Julia and the organisers in Dorset for Europe that stood up to the plate. Because in our view in Britain for Europe, if leaving the European Union was wrong on the 22nd of June 2016, it was wrong on the 24th of June 2016, and it continues to be wrong to date. So for this reason, since then, we have grown in numbers and number of organisations around the country, and it's great to see organisations such as Dorset for Europe now having grown to a size that they're capable of organising events like this with such a appropriate and varied panel as well. And we look forward to continuing to do this work for as long as is necessary for us to achieve our goal of continued membership of the European Union. So I'd like to introduce the panel now. So to my left we have Dr. Julie Smith, Baroness Smith of Newnham. She is an academic specialising in European politics and history of the European Union at the University of Cambridge. She is also the Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords. To her left, we have Hugo Dixon, who is a journalist, entrepreneur, and campaigner. He is the chair of InFacts, which I'm sure many of you know, and the co-founder of Common Ground, which is an organisation that we have worked with in the past and will continue to do so in the future as well. Thank you very much. On the far end on the right, we have Dr. Ruvi Ziegler, who is Associate Professor in International Refugee Law at the University of Reading School of Law. He is also the chair of the Oxford European Association. And to my right, we have Vikki Slade, who is the Liberal Democrat prospective parliamentary candidate for Mid-Dorset and North Poole. You might have seen announced that there was also meant to be a Professor Jens Hulschner. Unfortunately, he is ill and he sends his apologies, but he is here in spirit. So please everyone welcome the panel. Format of the event, we shall start with a panel discussion up to about 7 o'clock, and we will be covering 3 topics, sort of along the lines of a roadmap to stopping Brexit. What does it look like? What are the options? Is it even possible? The role of the centre ground in this the roadmap, and finally, how do we protect the rights of EU and UK citizens living in the UK and in the EU as well? So, for the first question, what does the roadmap of stopping Brexit look like? Dr. Julie, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes, not very loud.
Clap it.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yes. It is working.
Right, okay. What does the roadmap look like? There isn't a roadmap. And the future, the possible direction, I think, is complicated and rocking. If you think about the late 1950s and 1960s, when the UK was trying to join, or thinking about joining, the then common market, there was no roadmap. And almost immediately, General de Gaulle said, no, I don't want the UK to join. And everybody else listened to him and said, okay, we accept the UK is not joining. There is now a roadmap for joining the European Union. Until the Lisbon Treaty, there was no path out of the European Union. There was no legal way of leaving. Article 50 gives the legal way out of the European Union, but the route to do that isn't very clear. And the route to get back from triggering Article 50 is even less clear, because at least Article 50 is in the treaty. Reversing Article 50, there's no provision for it. So at the moment, we have the possibility and the hope in LibDem policy that we should have a referendum on whatever deal is negotiated for leaving. And that if we go to a referendum and offer the opportunity either of accepting leaving on the basis that's been negotiated or remaining, that the citizens of the UK will have the good sense to say, we actually want to remain. The alternative looks so much worse than staying in. we're actually going to stay, please. Now, that assumes that legally we can stop Article 50 now we've triggered it. And what we honestly don't know is whether we can do that. The only way we could tell would be to take a case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is the supreme irony, given that one of the key things that the Leavers were campaigning for was to get away from the rule of the Court of Justice. So it would be quite ironic if that was the thing that stopped us leaving, or stopped the change to the triggering of Article 50. But the assumption is that if a member state had triggered Article 50 and then changed its mind, that the other 27 states wouldn't stop us. So there isn't a roadmap, but there are possibilities of overturning the decision. What I think we're not going to see is Parliament overturning the decision at this stage. There is a very clear sense. We've had the triggering of Article 50. We now have the EU withdrawal bill. And if there is going to be a move to stay, then it really has to be done on the basis of the people, of ordinary British people, and ideally EU nationals who ought to be enfranchised, because the EU nationals resident in the UK are at least as affected as UK citizens resident here. Precisely, and if any of you here are EU nationals, you're exercising your treaty rights. And the referendum last year basically voted to take away the rights of EU nationals resident in the UK without giving you a say. So clearly, anyone resident here should have the right to vote in another referendum. So it's not quite a roadmap, but it's a set of possibilities. I'm going to stop here and assume that everyone wants relatively short answers, and then we'll come to a sort of group discussion. So hopefully that's enough for the moment.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about MPs not being able to vote down, I guess, the negotiated outcome. And perhaps, Vikki, you as a parliamentary candidate would like to say a few words about what you were saying earlier about your constituency as well.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, most people here will be relatively local, and you'll know that we're actually in a relatively strong Leave area, which makes life very difficult and makes it very problematic for some MPs to continue down their previous path. You know, they may have been a Remain MP, they now feel like they've got to go with the will of their own constituents to save their own skins. But I think there are opportunities within Parliament. One of the areas is the all-party parliamentary group on European relations, which sounds very dry, but we were hearing yesterday that Jo Swinson is one of the people leading it, but we've also got Anna Soubry and other key Remainers across the parties, Caroline Lucas, and their role within that APPG, the all-party parliamentary group, is to actually try to influence the Remainers within all of the parties to use the amendment processes to not change the decision, because we're in a difficult situation, but to expose the reality, because exactly as Julie said, their role is to make sure that the facts come out, because at the moment we're all living in echo chambers. You know, we are talking to a group of people who agree with us, and the newspapers talk to people that already agree with them, and our big job is to cross over, find a way of crossing over to the people who don't agree with us, because unless we can convince those people, nothing will change. And that's where this APPG group has the opportunity to introduce and influence people on amendments so that they can make sure that the wider parliamentary groups are on board a little bit more. But it is really a series of blind alleys. I remain convinced, though, that I remain completely convinced, having spent quite a lot of time last year in European countries on a European women's leadership programme, that Europe wants us to stay, and they need us to stay, because if we leave and we do okay, then there will be others that will follow. So it's in everybody's interest for us to stay. So whilst there is no rule book, there is no roadmap, I think if we gave the hint that we didn't want to do this anymore, I'm sure they would bend over backwards to make sure it worked for everybody. So I'm confident that there will be a way. We just have to make it up as we go along.
You mentioned the press speaking to an echo chamber. Hugo, would you like to say something about press being an echo chamber, and what role perhaps do you think the press can play in stopping Brexit, I guess?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Vikki, and thank you, Julie. The roadmap, all roads to stop Brexit go through a change in public opinion. If we don't change public opinion, we are, to borrow a Borisism, whistling in the wind. So we have to change public opinion. So yes, it's fine to talk about how it would be nice to have a referendum. Yes, it's fine to talk about how it would be nice if MPs stood up to the plate. But neither of those things is going to happen unless public opinion changes. Therefore, the lion's share of the energy that we put in over the next 12 months has to go to changing public opinion. Okay, so I think we've actually got a very good case. And I'm going to give you, if it's not too much time, I'm going to give you in simplified form what I think are the 7 messages. And I know 7 messages is far too many, but anyway, here we go. 7 messages which I think can help shift public opinion. First, the Tories are making a Horlicks of Brexit. They are, and actually that message is already getting through. That is the one bit of public opinion where there has been a sea change since the election. Before the election, they thought the government knew what it was doing. Now, generally speaking, they think it doesn't. But we need to drive home our advantage on that. So that's the first thing. They're making a Horlicks of it. Secondly, the Brexit vote was based on a pack of lies. Now that is also coming through. The 350 million lie, and it was, resurfaced again yesterday, but it's being squished down. You probably saw the head of the UK Statistics Authority came out and said it was, I can't remember the words, but basically misleading official statistics. But it's not just the 350 million. Actually, although that's the most blatant, barefaced lie, there are actually more important lies, such as they need us more than we need them. It's going to be easy, we're going to do lots of trade deals with the rest of the world. That Turkey is going to join in 2020. There are actually bigger lies than the 350 million. And that message is getting through, that it was all based on a pack of lies and false promises. Third, this is not yet getting through, but really important, in a democracy, people are free to change their minds. What we're actually being told, bombarded with, is that somehow it's undemocratic to say anything, that we've got to keep mum. Well, that is actually an abuse of democracy. Free speech is the foundation of democracy, and we have got a very strong argument on that. And it's not just important for us, it's important that soft leavers feel that they have the permission to change their mind. It is not a democracy if it's one person, one vote, one time. Fourth, and this is, I'm afraid, the traditional Project Fear, and it has to be part of our mix, but we mustn't exaggerate it, we mustn't fall into the Osborne-Cameron trap. But it is true that Brexit will damage our prosperity, our influence, and our country. Just think of what's, the problems that are emerging over the Northern Ireland border. Now, we don't want to exaggerate that, but it's real. We don't want to exaggerate what has already happened. There are already signs of damage, but let's not fall into the trap, and let's not make our campaign a one-trick pony of Project Fear. But it has to be part of the mix. Fifth, and this is the positive side, EU membership helps us tackle the challenges and grasp the opportunities of the 21st century. Now, I think this is coming our way too. Terrorism, Putin, the whole boiling cauldron of the Middle East and North Africa. It's a dangerous world out there. Global warming, and frankly, the election of Donald Trump in the White House makes it even more crazy that the Brexiteers have decided that we should throw our lot in with America and cut ourselves off from our closest allies here in Europe. So EU membership really helps us. Sixth, Brexit doesn't mean taking control, it means losing control. And this actually is, I think, the biggest lie of them all that the Brexiters told us. It's not about gaining control. We're already seeing it. What's happening? Theresa May, in her hapless negotiation, is going to have to cede jurisdiction to the European Court of Justice without us even having a judge on the court. We're going to have to follow the rules of the EU without being one of the rule makers. And one of the travesties and lies of the referendum campaign was that we are not influential. In fact, we are one of the most influential members of the EU. They trotted out that figure of the number of times that we lost votes. Well, we did lose a few votes, but we lost 56 votes since 1999. And do you know how many we won? 7,000. It was 2,466. That means 98% of the time we were on the winning side. Well, in Theresa May's future Brexit world, we're not going to be on the winning side anytime. We're just going to be taking dictation. So it's a complete, and as a patriot, this is what really worries me, which brings me to the final thing, is that the most patriotic thing to do today in Britain is to stand up against Brexit. And we cannot allow people like the Foreign Secretary to pretend that it is somehow anti-democratic and unpatriotic to be against Brexit. The young people who are going out there protesting, and, if I may say, the people of my generation and maybe even a few older, are doing something that is hugely patriotic. We must not allow the other side to claim that card. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on the point that you mentioned. I think it was point 5. I took notes. It's pretty useful in my line of work. EU membership allows us to tackle the global challenges, and you mentioned the migration problem that we're facing. Now, obviously, that was spun in a different direction. However, I would like to hear from Dr. Ziegler. You know a few things about refugee law. Perhaps you could tell us about how the EU is actually tackling that issue.
Yeah, sure. So let me do that, and then if I could perhaps relate to a couple of things that have arisen already. I think what we see happening in the EU 27, as you were, when it comes to facing immigration from outside the EU, not intra-EU migration, but primarily irregular arrivals from North Africa and from the Middle East, is really the struggle between centralized, efficient, equitable decision-making and implementation of a common European asylum system, and that cherished sovereignties that states still hold on to, especially in this context, the Visegrad group, so Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland and Slovakia. And we see this now being really coming to a climax with the Court of Justice ruling against Hungary and Slovakia's appeals against this scheme of relocation of refugees within the European Union, which was intended to relieve some of the inequitable burden that currently Greece and Italy are faced with, which risks in turn European solidarity. And there are now infringement proceedings of the EU Commission against those countries. Now, this is a real test for the EU, and I'll try to explain in a minute why the UK matters here. It's a real test for the EU because the EU has principles such as the right to asylum, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and has a common European asylum system, but that has one fundamental flaw, which is the Dublin system of inequitable burden sharing. Essentially, the first country of entry has to deal with refugees, which is why Greece and Italy are overburdened. And for that to change, what needs to happen actually is more Europe rather than less Europe, right? So for that to change, for essentially 1.2 million refugees to be equitably absorbed in a population of 508 million EU citizens, right? So that's less than 0.2%. What needs to happen is an acceptance of those other states that the European project isn't just about individual instrumental rights, which of course the Visegrad group is very fond of, right? They are very fond of the idea that you have freedom of movement of European citizens within the EU, but they don't quite like the other elements of the European project. And so I think what we see now is the European Union potentially, and this was in Juncker's speech, but also in Guy Verhofstadt's speech, an attempt of the European Union reasserting its principles with the hope of actually using Brexit as a time of consolidation. And my fear is, and this is where I link it to Brexit in a minute, my fear is that rather than seeing Brexit as a challenge, the European Union as a result sees it as an opportunity. Because Theresa May, certainly this government, but arguably the previous government as well, have not been helpful on the issue of immigration from outside the EU. They have stopped funding for search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean. Theresa May went to the UN in September last year and gave a speech where she said, well, we need to redefine refugees more restrictively. That was her approach to migration. So it's no wonder that she wasn't even invited to the summit in Paris last month, which Macron has convened. Now, how does this then relate to our project, as it were, of stopping Brexit? Now, I agree entirely with Julie that there is a questionable legal debate as to, or the questionable legal dilemma as to whether Article 50 is revocable, but I also agree that if there is political will, there will be a political way. But I think that political will, in turn, needs to indicate that there has been a fundamental change in the UK's public. And because the process started with a referendum, I fear it will be very difficult to make that argument, even in the context of a potential case to Court of Justice, if the process doesn't end with a referendum. And so my final point on this goes back to Parliament and to the EU withdrawal bill, because there's been a lot of talk, justifiably, about the Henry VIII so-called clauses and the way in which EU law will be transplanted into UK legislation. There's been less talk, and thankfully it has been picked up by eagle-eyed MPs from various parties, I should say, that Clause 9, as it stands of the bill, actually allows a minister, it doesn't even specify the minister, a minister, to decide the date on which we leave the European Union. It's actually, that is the way it's written. There is no need, if the bill is passed as it's currently stands, there is no need even for a further vote, let alone a parliamentary act for leaving, which means that if no deal is better than a bad deal, if that's still the case, I don't know. It depends on which side, which page of the Telegraph you read. But if that is still the case, then Boris Johnson or somebody else could just decide at some point when the negotiations fail that we leave. So I think it's crucial as a first step, certainly just one necessary but clearly insufficient step, that the bill gets amended, not just in this element, but very much also in this element, so that that power remains in parliamentary hands, and that in turn, with the change in public opinion, that we hope will happen, will potentially lead to Parliament, when we come perhaps to next autumn, then demanding another referendum.
Thank you very much. And absolutely, you mentioned about the role of amendments, the role of MPs in this whole process, but also as part of some of the consequences of Brexit, there has been a feeling or an understanding that politics in the UK has become extreme. We've had the right drift to the right, the Conservative Party drift to the right, and we've had parties on the left drift to the left as well, with the Labour Party obviously going a lot further to the left as it had been over the last few years. So that leads us nicely on to our second question, which is what role can the centre ground of British politics play to stop Brexit? Vikki, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, so I think this is where the LibDems really have an opportunity, and I think we need to be really conciliatory, because over the last 10 years politics has become more tribal, and the centre has been squeezed out, even though the centre has got bigger, which is a sort of a bit of a bizarre thing to happen. And I think as the main centrist party, we have to accept that if we're going to get the message across, whilst we're the main party in the middle, there are people in every other party and no party who feel that they're in the centre. And we need to open our arms out to all of those people, accept that we're not going to agree on everything, that we have different ways of doing things, but actually accept a role as the lead party in the centre, and say, look, you might naturally be a Cameron Conservative or a Blairite Labour, or a soft Green, but actually you need to embrace us and we need to embrace you, because otherwise we're all going to be going down our own little individual roads and we're getting nowhere at all. And I think we've got to be really open with that and say, look, we're going to have to disagree on tuition fees or gay marriage or electoral reform, whatever it is, but on this we're united, and this has an impact on everything else. You know, the rights of people are going to be hugely damaged, so therefore if you disagree on human rights, well actually this is actually something that can unite us on human rights, because Brexit is going to affect all of that. So the important thing there is to reach out, is to find the common ground and suppress the things that we disagree on, and just, yeah, I think just that's really it. It is about reaching out, and that's where this APPG is really good. And then Julie will be able to talk more about how the different parties can work together. And I think if we can work together on something as fundamental as Brexit, we also have the opportunity to put the trust back into politics, because it has been about mudslinging for an awful long time. And if we can put those differences aside and talk about the things that unite us, we have the opportunity for people to go, actually maybe politicians aren't all in it for themselves, they are in it for the greater good. And I think this is a huge opportunity we have to grasp.
Dr. Julie Smith, would you agree that the House of Lords perhaps is not experiencing the same level of polarisation as the House of Commons is?
No. If it's a yes/no answer, then
No,
I would
no,
start no. And I read something about Amber Rudd earlier today, where somebody said the good thing about Amber Rudd is if a question is a yes/no question, her first word is yes or no, which you don't normally expect from a politician. And so I think I would say no, there is polarisation in the House of Lords, but it is there are far fewer people who are on the hard extreme Brexit side of things. But it always used to be that the House of Lords appeared to be much more pro-Remain than the House of Commons, and that many of the people there, particularly on the Conservative benches, were former Heathites, people that you'd really expect to be pro-Remain. Some of them are, but there are still people like Nigel Lawson and others who are absolutely clear they want out of the European Union. So it is divided, but there is a lot more opportunity, I think, in the House of Lords to find ways of amending the legislation. So when I was asked about the roadmap earlier, I was thinking more about, do we look at, how do we stop Brexit? If we're looking at how we amend the withdrawal bill, then I think it is easier for the Lords to amend than it is for the Commons, because the arithmetic is different. We don't have the Conservatives don't have a majority, even with a DUP, in the House of Lords. We have crossbenchers, many of whom are strongly pro-Remain. And Labour in the Lords are rather more Blairite than in the Commons. So the Lords' Labour peers are not, there aren't very many Corbynistas among them, and there aren't very many Leavers among them. But equally, there is a move within Labour in the House of Lords, as in the House of Commons, to accept that the referendum delivered a vote to leave. So what we're not going to get is a mass change in the Lords to say we must stop Brexit, but what I think we absolutely can get is a majority to amend the legislation to make it less awful. And it is in some ways easier in the Lords to do that. The one thing I would slightly be cautious about flagging up the APPG too much. You can have meetings in public and discuss things and say, all these people who are members of the all-party parliamentary group. But we also have to remember that MPs and peers are subject to their whips, and the Conservative whips are pretty brutal. So I think we just need to bear in mind that what is said in public and issues that are raised, there may be different conversations going on in private. So there may be more constructive things going on in private than we see in public. But equally, when it comes down to it, many of the Tories are more tribal and keen to hold themselves together as a party than they are about ensuring that the Brexit legislation is amended.
I'd like to ask Hugo a very similar question. If polarisation is happening in British politics, a lot of people will say that it's happening in British press as well. Would you like to comment on polarisation in the British press?
Not particularly. I want to address the question of what we can do from the centre to stop Brexit. And I think I'm going to say a couple of things on what can be done in Parliament, although I've said that's not the main action. I do think that there are some useful things that can be done on the withdrawal bill. And I think actually the most important thing is to get, the most important thing that is achievable is to get the bill amended so that there is what's called a meaningful vote at the end of the process, whether there's a deal or not. The government has promised a vote on a deal, and has said that if there is a deal and Parliament doesn't like it, then we'll leave without a deal, which of course would be a disaster. That's not the sort of vote that we want. And in any case, it's only a promise. It's not actually in legislation. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be put into this bill a commitment that there will be a vote either on the withdrawal agreement, or failing that, if there isn't and so there has to be some sort of timetable put in place that by a certain point in time it has to come back to Parliament for approval to continue with these negotiations. And failing that, then we will not be able to get Parliament at this stage, in my view, to say that failing that we should stay in the EU. But I think that if we can put enough of a roadblock there, if by that point in time public opinion has changed, then there will be an unstoppable force for a referendum, what Vince is calling the first fact-based referendum. But I want to come back to, well, actually that is quite an interesting, that's a segue into the point that I was actually going to make, which is that in such a scenario, there are, I think, two ways that the political crisis that would be unleashed could be resolved. The first, and I think from our perspective the best, would be for such a referendum. But the alternative is that there could be another election. And what we do not want to see is a rerun of the June election where the centre got squeezed virtually out of existence. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, and I don't want to dwell on Tim Farron, but what I do think is important, which is a more strategic thing, is that the parties of, let's call it, I'm not sure if we can really even call them the parties of the centre, but let's say the moderately sensible parties didn't, and there are not many of them, didn't come together in any way. And you saw that the Greens stood down, I think, in about 30 seats to help others, Labour, Lib Dems, get a leg up. I think the Lib Dems stood down only in 2 seats to help the Greens. Maybe one they stood down to help the Women's Equality Party. I tried to organise, and I was very pleased to see Vikki using the expression common ground. Through common ground, we tried to organise, actually, during the last Parliament, in a couple of by-elections, we tried to organise primaries, cross-party primaries among pro-Europeans, and also tried to organise them during the general election. Now, frankly, we didn't have enough time to get our act together properly, but it also has to be said that apart from the Greens, there was not much enthusiasm. There was some enthusiasm among individual Lib Dems, but among what was then the Lib Dem High Command, there was no enthusiasm. In fact, there was strong opposition to the idea, and there was the idea, don't be silly, Hugo, we're going to do this ourselves, we are going to win, we're riding high, we're going to win lots and lots of seats, and if you want to help our cause, stop trying to organise primaries, just tell everybody to vote Lib Dem. Anyway, I tried to organise something in Vauxhall, where Kate Hoey actually at one point was facing 4 different pro-Europeans, the Lib Dem, the Green, the Women's Equality, and then an independent Labour, who actually ultimately pulled out. And I also tried to organise one in my constituency in Kensington, and I floated the idea in St Albans with Daisy Cooper. But anyway, as I say, partly it was because there just wasn't enough time, and partly it was because the attitude of the High Command. Now, my view is that if there is a general election before the end of the Article 50 process, and I would say I'd put that at about 1 in 3 at the moment, we need to be prepared, and the sensible or half-sensible pro-European forces have got to come together. And one of the things that I'm going to be exploring through Common Ground is if there is any appetite under the new Lib Dem regime that we've had since the election to embrace this idea. And if there is, we wouldn't do this at the last minute, which was the basic problem that we had. But what we'd do is we would do it in advance. We would, perhaps in the spring of next year, we'd have a primary season in maybe 50 seats, and honestly, the Lib Dems would win most of them. So there's a hell of a lot in it for the Lib Dems, but the Greens would win a few, and who knows, maybe one, here or there you might find an independent winning. And they would come through, and the deal would be that you'd have an open primary for any candidate who was pro-European. You'd have to define what benchmark was, but basically probably it would have to be in favour of a referendum on the ratification, or a fact-based referendum or something like that. And any candidate that took part and failed to win would then commit not to stand in a subsequent general election if that general election took place before the end of the Article 50 process. So what would that achieve? Well, hopefully what that would do is that would change the narrative in those seats, and you would then, the winner, the standard bearer who came through in those seats wouldn't be squeezed by the Corbyn effect, which is what we saw in June of this year, and he wasn't pro-European. I mean, you got all these people voting Corbyn because they thought he was a pro-European. So if you could change that dynamic, then in that election, now of course Vince thinks he might become Prime Minister in that election, but even, let's say he doesn't become Prime Minister, but he manages to increase the number of seats he gets, and the Scottish nationalists hold on to their seats, and then if you manage to get a group of people who've come through, many of whom might be Lib Dem, some Green, some a few others, who've come through on this combined pro-European platform, together they would be in a position to hold the balance of power and would then be able to tell Corbyn, who presumably would become Prime Minister in those circumstances, look, the deal is we'll back you, but only if you agree to a referendum. So that is something that I think that people need to start thinking very seriously about. I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but it is a scenario, and that's a very practical thing that we can do. But it won't happen if the Lib Dems are as tribal as Labour.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we'll go straight to our third and final question. How should the Remain cause safeguard the rights of EU 27 citizens and UK citizens?
Right, so what I want to do is essentially talk about what I think are three elements that are analytically distinct of the citizens' rights discussion. And all of them are important, and at least one of them is also important for the broader question of how we reverse our general course. So the first, which should have really been a non-question by now, is the question of unilateral guarantees for EU 27 citizens in the UK. I mean, of course, there were many amendments, including ones that passed the Lords, but then in the ping pong with the Commons on the Article 50 notification failed to win approval in the Commons. They were dropped before the UK triggered Article 50. And we're now really exactly as was predicted in a bargaining chips strategy of the UK government, which includes, according to the own government's proposal, genuine diminution of current rights of EU27 citizens, including on the need to reapply for settled status, which would then elapse if people leave after 2 years. We don't know what the cutoff date will be, so if somebody arrives today to study at Reading University, we don't know whether they'll have postgraduate rights, if that is after Brexit. Even the Home Office, they tweeted this poster a couple of days ago saying you need not do anything because you will have broadly the same access to services. Whenever you see the road broadly, be very suspicious. So, I mean, I'm very glad that the Liberal Democrats passed yesterday a motion that includes unilateral guarantees. It's not too late. It is one of the amendments to the withdrawal bill. I hope this time you will go through. I equally hope, and that links me to the second point, I equally hope that the European Parliament and consequently the European Council will drop also the negotiating position that it currently holds when it comes to UK citizens in the EU27, because at the moment it is also leading them to have a diminution of their rights. They are going to be, as it were, relegated to third country national status. They will lose, for instance, their right to move between EU member states, the right to vote in local government elections. My hope is that if the UK moves fast, as it should have done before the triggering of Article 50, that may prompt that change in the EU27, because I'm not very optimistic at all that there will be an agreement. And if there isn't an agreement, then those rights are not secured. But that really links me to or takes me to the second point, which I think is often kind of sidesteps in the debate, and that is the actual loss of rights for all of the people who live in this country. And that really then subdivides into two. So one is the substantive rights that are derived from the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which again the withdrawal bill says will be not transplanted into UK law. And they try to convince the public that that means no effect on rights, but that's simply legally incorrect. So there are rights on employment, on the environment, on the rights of the child, on equality in certain categories which just do not exist in UK law, other than through the application of the Charter and then the disapplication of law that breaches those rights. And so I think that can be then in turn used to what I call some sort of a re-education about the virtues of EU citizenship and EU citizenship rights. So I was actually quite encouraged. I saw data that the EU Commission published about the level of attachments that people in different EU member states feel towards the European project. And actually, in all member states except Hungary, including the United Kingdom, the level of attachment to the European project in the questions of, is EU membership a good thing, and do you feel attached to the EU, has gone up since the referendum. In the UK, the answers are 49 and 51%. So, but they have been lower a year before. And I mean, you would be surprised to hear that the highest hike has been in Ireland. They now see the virtue of EU citizenship. And I think one thing practically that can be done on this is that there are 2 European citizen initiatives which have been authorized by the European Commission and which people from different member states can sign, which talk about the possibility of Britons retaining EU citizenship rights, all Britons, that is, all Britons who live here, not just those who live already in the EU 27. That is disassociating the status of the United Kingdom as a member state of the EU from individual rights. Now, I don't think that in of itself would trigger that legal change in EU law, not least because it then goes to the Commission and to a debate if it succeeds in getting the million signatures that you need. But it does have the psychological effect. If this gets promoted, so I can give people, later I can circulate the data of this. If instead of people signing public petitions on things like referendums, they sign those initiatives, and people in Brussels see, well, there are actually 5 million Brits who want to retain their EU citizenship rights. I think that might have an effect in changing some of the dynamics of our discourse, at the very least in bringing this to the public awareness.
Thank you very much. Julie, would you like to say something about the question 3?
This is one of the most frustrating issues that I've come across in the last 15 months. In the week after the referendum, there was cross-party support in the House of Lords to give a unilateral guarantee to EU citizens resident in the United Kingdom. The only people who disagreed were the government frontbench and Lord Pearson of Rannoch, former UKIP leader. Whether it was Nigel Lawson, Michael Forsyth, any of the hard levers on the Conservative side, Remainers, soft levers, anybody else, recognised we should be giving unilateral guarantees. And over the intervening period, all the Tories gradually slipped in behind the Prime Minister. And I think that is really one of the worst aspects of the aftermath of the referendum. It goes along with the racism that was beginning to come to the fore during the referendum. And I think it shows us as a country to be small-minded. The issue of what Remainers can do, I think it's quite difficult, because what we need to do is work on the government to persuade it to change its approach. And that obviously is predominantly a parliamentary matter. But I think, again, it's one of the areas where we need public opinion. We need there to be a sense that something to persuade the government that there is a moral reason to take the right decision, but also that it is actually in the interests of the country and of business, not just of EU nationals, but of other decision makers and others in the UK. That, if you're a business, you want your workers to have certainty. Because if you've got EU nationals saying, well, I think I might just go back to Warsaw or Prague or Sicily, that actually creates real business uncertainty. And I think there might be some pragmatic ways of trying to persuade the government of looking at things differently. But I think what we've ended up with, people being used as bargaining chips, has turned the country in a direction that is not particularly pleasant, and one where we need to be looking at ourselves as a country and working out what we want to be, where we want to go. And at the moment, we haven't got that right.
Yes. Okay, so there's questions then. If anyone has questions, if you'd come, unfortunately the cord does not extend far enough, so you'll have to either shout or come to the front.
I can shout.
We have a representative democracy. That's not changed. And I do agree we need to change some public opinion, but there is an awful lot of public opinion out there that won't change. So what do? We just accept it. We go down the most chaotic Brexit we can have. And if you read the Times yesterday, when they were talking about us coming out of the customs union, the whole country just falls apart. Now, I'm an avid Remainer and I'm happy to talk to people and persuade, but there are a certain amount that won't. And part of me almost thinks that we have to go down this awful route for them to believe it. Because if you want people to believe it, rather than being a representative democracy and making decisions for our country, which is in our best interest, you're not going to get it.
I just wanted to try and make a concrete suggestion, if you like, because we're constantly thinking about what can we do next, how, what do our politicians do for us to progress this? And I think in some ways we're putting too much faith in our politicians. Now, and I say that as someone who stood as a parliamentary candidate. But if there's one person or one group of people that MPs are more scared of than their chief whip, it's us. And the part of the reason that Brexit is going the way it's going at the moment is because they are scared stiff of us. They are scared stiff of going against this will of the people. Now, what we've got to be able to do is show them that the will of the people is changing. And the way we do that, or my suggestion would be, we have groups like this. We have Dorset against Brexit, or Dorset for Europe, and things like that. And it was very, very important at the start of this for it to be a non-party organisation. I had reservations about that because I think it actually made it more difficult for people like me to get involved, because I very clearly and publicly have a LibDem label. People know I'm a LibDem candidate. So I very consciously tried to take a bit of a back seat with it because I wanted it to be seen as non-partisan. Now, I think what you need to do now is change that round. Don't make it non-party, make it all-party. So that if you are a Labour voting Remainer, sit here with your Labour sweatshirt on. If you are a Tory Remainer, wear your Tory rosette. If you're a Lib Dem, wear your Lib Dem lanyard. If you're Green, sit here with your green t-shirt on. Okay? Let them know that the opposition to Brexit is coming from all parties. We're not going to take it. It's not just the Lib Dems in the middle. And what I was finding on the doorsteps is people think, oh yeah, that's the Lib Dems who just want to stay in them. No, it's not. It's all of us. So join your parties. If you're broadly Labour supporting, join your local Labour branch. Put pressure on from within. Yeah? And any party.
Thank you very much. Do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah, I've got to go, so I just want to respond to that.
Oh.
The problem is, you're absolutely right, the MPs are scared of the electorate. Yeah. The problem is, Remainers are too rational, they're too reasonable, they're too nice. They're scared of the Leave voters because they're not like that. They're prepared to voice their concern, their criticism, and to make it very clear that they're not going to allow the Leave vote to be stopped. We've got to be the same. We've got to stop being so rational, so nice. I was very disturbed, actually, by the amendment today at the Lib Dem conference, because it's just weakening. Oh, we're so nice. Oh, yes, let's go to the people. The other side aren't very nice. And if we're going to compete with them and get the MPs scared of us, we've got to change our stance.
Does anyone have a question for the panel?
Yes. Question? Yeah.
Would you like to use the microphone? It is a question for the panel.
Shall I use the mic? Hello, I'm Sarah from Dorset for Europe. My question is about the timing of a second referendum, or a referendum on the Leave deal. It seems like the only political way to go but I'm worried that by the time we've got a decision and then had a referendum, so much damage may have been done on both sides, it may be too late. So I'd just like to hear people's views on that.
Can I respond quickly to this? I mean, I think there's damage, there's lasting damage in terms of the UK's reputation. It already lost its damage in terms of its ability to negotiate things. And as Julie said, kind of the small-mindedness about EU 27 citizens. But I don't think it's entirely irreparable. And I do think, going back to the point about irrevocability of Article 50, so if we run into a scenario where either we have first a general election or we get to the next autumn, we see there's no deal or there's a very bad deal and Parliament pressures a referendum through, and that carries us beyond March, my assumption is that negotiations will then be extended formally by agreement with the other member states, precisely because of the point that Julie has made, that they, if there's a sense that we might stay, they all want us to leave. So I just think realistically, damage will be done. Ideally, we need it to happen earlier or sooner rather than later. But we need to conversely think, right, that we also need some time to sway public opinion to change. And that does take time. I mean, with Iraq, it took probably the swing in the position of people who previously supported the war to see the ramifications of the war probably took a couple of years. And so we have that window. It's not long, but I wouldn't push it too quickly as well. I mean, I think that's the point that Vince now makes quite well, that he distinguishes saying, you know, a month after the referendum when people said, let's now have another referendum, he said, then it would have been wrong to have another referendum, but as we see the deal, it will be right. And I think that, with respect, is the correct approach.
Yeah, I mean, can I just respond? Obviously, some people will be uncomfortable about what happened today, but I think actually what happened today is the best possible outcome we can have, because if we were to go out very strongly and say, we will stop Brexit, that would be thwarting the will of the people, because we're just saying, well, we're just going to do it. Actually, if we just did it, we're going to get ourselves elected and we're just going to do it, that would inflame the vicious, violent extremists who would say, well, hang on a minute, who gave you the right to do that? I think it's really important that, as somebody said, it was started with a referendum, and the only way, but it's a bit like retracing your steps. We've gone down a particular path, and the only way to undo, it's a bit like knitting, isn't it? If you're doing your knitting, the only way to actually get back where you were is to unpick those steps. And the only way to rationalise people who believe that it's right for us to leave is to say, right, okay, let's go part the way down this road. It is going to damage us, but it won't damage us irrevocably. There will be damage, we've done damage, but we can salvage this. Is this really what you want? If it is really what you want, then we, as Remainers, have to accept that. But it's been done on the basis of facts, and people have had that cross-checked, and they know. But at the end of the day, if we don't give them the time to digest that, then actually we could very easily be accused of being as bad as the closed-minded Brexiteers. I think it really is important, and I was really heartened that even people who were supporting the absolutely stop Brexit, even a lot of them said, you know what, I can live with the amendment, because it does mean that we're saying, let's see how bad this is. If we think we can live with it, fair enough. Those of us that don't agree with it, well, we'll just have to swallow our pride and say, people have decided again, and that's the end of that. But this has got to be the only way. We've gone into it with a referendum, we come out of it with a referendum. Nobody can argue then that they didn't have the chance. And if you still feel strongly about it, please feel free to vote Brexit again. But I think that's the only way. I genuinely do.
Thank you. Now, our panel will leave at 7:30 maximum. So we'll have another question. And lady,
Okay. Hi, I'm Carol. I'm a EU 27 national and part of Brighton and Hove for Europe. So thank you for voting to kind of push for our rights I'm curious as to why you haven't gone for a reciprocal agreement to kind of negotiate the Brits in the Europe at the same time.
Because it's worse.
The one thing the United Kingdom could have done, and it could have been done in June of last year, was to say, this is something that is important. We have voted, but we realise it affects the rights of people who are resident here, and we are going to do the right thing. It would have set the right tone. It would have created the opportunity then to take negotiations forward. One of the things that Angela Merkel said almost immediately was she was worried about the rights of German citizens resident here. If we'd said we've sorted it, then it may not have led to reciprocity, but I think the idea of hanging on to reciprocity once Article 50 was finally triggered, and then, you know, nothing is going to be agreed until everything's agreed in the negotiations, and we have left everybody with uncertainty. If we'd gone for reciprocity at the outset, we'd still be waiting for a decision, I think.
Hugo? Well, I'd like to say a few things, not about that, but well, there's one thing I'd like to say about that. One thing I'd like to say about that is that you know, very good that we put pressure, we try to amend for citizens' rights, etc. But the surest way of protecting the EU citizens' rights is to stop Brexit, and the second surest way of stopping it is to make sure that we don't crash out without a deal. If we crash out without a deal, their rights are completely up in the air. If there's a deal, you can be pretty sure that the rights will be guaranteed. I wanted to say just something about this man who left, I think, who said we had to be nasty. Yes. Look, we've got to be forceful, we've got to be passionate, but we must be truthful, and we must be civilized, because otherwise we will pollute our national life in the way that the Brexiters have done. And that is even more important than stopping Brexit, in my view.
I think we've got time for one final question. Good. You in the back had your hand up for a while.
This is a question, but I'll start by saying,
right.
I'm tired of hearing about it's the will of the people when I think most people realise it's not. I think it's the will of the billionaires. There's been, we know that the media is being manipulated by people like Murdoch and Mercer. We're battling the far-right media. So how do we, when you say we need to change attitudes, how can we, in this environment, dealing with this kind of media, which is so, in Europe they can't believe the kind of coverage that we get. They get a much clearer coverage about it. We're up against that. We have politicians who are too afraid to speak up and say, politicians need to speak up and help change people's minds. They are not doing that. They're too afraid of the far right and the Brexiteers. So I would like to know how, when you say, yes, it's important to change people's minds, us in the grassroots, we're doing that. We need some help from the politicians to actually be more vocal, saying this is bad for this country. Why are we dependent on someone like Gina Miller to bring a court case? Why didn't a politician do that? So
thank you for your question.
Thank you. I'll just respond quickly. I mean, I think politicians can use the politicians' tools, as you were, and I do think, in a way, the travesty, and I return to this, which is where I started earlier, the travesty of the way the government has decided to craft the EU withdrawal bill actually gives an opportunity, because it demonstrates what sort of vision they have, both in terms of where control should really lie, that is in the executive and not in parliament, who should scrutinize legislation, that is civil servants potentially, and maybe not even that. The fact that they fundamentally remove the Charter of Fundamental Rights explicitly. They don't want the government to be sued for damages for rights infringements. So I think if we, as you were, pick it line by line in the public, saying this is the Tory Brexit vision, then that actually kind of, as you were, moves us slightly away from the wider question of whether Brexit is a good or a bad thing. It's the fact that this is the Brexit of often. This is what we see, to kind of use metaphors not of knitting, but of cooking. This is what we see cooked, being cooked in our oven. And we don't like that, so let's turn the oven off now. Right?
Thank you. Hugo, you'd like.
Yes, I just want to say, I'm afraid if you're expecting politicians to rescue you, you're living in a dream world. Politicians will not lead, they will follow. Apart from, of course, a few noble exceptions in the LibDems and the Greens, etc. So don't expect them to rescue us. Now, you have said there is a real problem with the media, and there is a real problem with the media. The answer, I think, is a well-organized, well-funded pro-European campaign. Now, it shouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility to create such a thing. There are enough business interests who are really already hurting and who should be willing to fund such a thing, but it hasn't yet, unfortunately, despite lots of discussions which I've been involved in. I know Tom has connected with European movement and things like that, but we haven't managed yet to create a single powerful organization that can then raise millions of pounds, which we can then use through social media to pump out the message. There are the messages, they're powerful messages, but we haven't managed to create a megaphone to get those across. Now, that is a big failure, but if we manage to solve that, I think we could change public opinion, and if we change public opinion, then your politicians will stand up, but not before.
I'd just like to defend politicians because I think there is I think it's actually quite unfair that there's an awful lot of people who are working really hard within politics to make change. Public don't actually want politicians. You know, I see hostility everywhere I go, despite the fact that most people enter politics for the right reasons. And I also see organisations that want to deliberately remain apolitical, and I tend to agree with Phil. You guys need to embrace us too, because if you decide that you're not prepared to actually openly talk about the fact that the Lib Dems are on the same side as you, we may have a different way of going about it, because we also have to reflect all of the other things we stand for. You know, we want to do an awful lot of things. You have one issue which unites you, but we have to think about all of the other things that we have to do as politicians. And I think it's really unfair to say Gina Miller is an absolute superstar. You know, she deserves huge credit. But if Gina Miller was a party politician, she would never have had that opportunity, because the press don't want to hear from parties like the Lib Dems, the public don't want to hear, and organisations that have founded themselves as being anti-establishment don't want to hear. So it is a two-way street, you know. I mean, I've been really lucky because of me being willing to openly embrace the Remain movement. I've had some amazing people in this room who have openly supported my campaign, but even then, they were a little bit reluctant to actually wave the yellow flag, even though they were doing it for one specific reason. So it is a two-way street. We will embrace you guys, but you've got to embrace us too, and you have to understand that we have to work it in different ways, and if we work together, we can get there. But if we actually start fighting about the best way forward and how we won't help you and you won't help us, no one's going to get anywhere.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think that's the end of the meeting, so if you could... Thank you to the panel and everyone that took part today. Everyone on the panel, please. Thank you very much for coming. It was great to have you. You have to stay because we're having drinks, and there's a gentleman called Peter French who would like to talk to you. Peter Cook, sorry.
Hello. Just to say, there will be a collection. If anyone could drop in £1 or something towards the cost of the room and the refreshments and everything. We understood that Peter Cook would like to announce his event which is happening now. Okay, would you like to say a few words?